I just want your clarification on this matter.
Brother Pradeep has asked a very good question.
Brother asked a very good question. Brother asked a very good question, very relevant question, to the point.
Sisters asked a very good question, very common question, very important question.
Brother asked a good question.
Brother Naushad has asked a very interesting question.
Sisters asked a very good question.
Brother asked a very good question, very important question, very practical question.
A non-Muslim brother asked a good question. The brother asked a very important question.
The brother has posed a very important question. The brother has asked a very important question. The brother has asked a question. The brother has asked a very good question.
Or the sisters asked the question.
The brother asked the question. The brother has asked a very good question.
Sister asked a very good question.
The sister asked a very good question. Very long question. Very good question.
The brother asked a very good question.
Sister posed a very good question.
The brother asked a very good question.
Brother Danny has asked a very good question.
Brother asked a very good question. A non-Muslim brother asked a very good question.
Sister asked a very good question.
Thank you.
Brother Bayan has asked a very good question. Brother Mahesh Mehta has asked a very good question. Sisters asked a very good question.
The brother asked a very important question, a very relevant question.
Sisters asked a very, very relevant question, very good question, and a common question asked about qadar.
The brother asked a very good question, very important question, very relevant question. And that's a very good question.
Brother Jacob has asked a very important question.
The sisters asked a very important question. The sisters asked a very important question.
The brother asked a very good question. Sisters asked a very good question.
MashaAllah. Brother asked a very good question. Brother asked a very good question.
Sisters asked a very good question.
The brother asked a very good question.
The brother asked a good question. The brother asked a very good question.
Brother asked a very good question.
The brother asked a very good question.
Sisters asked a very good question.
Sisters asked a very good question. Sisters asked a very good question. Brother asked a very good question. The brother asked a very good question. Sisters asked a very good question.
The brother asked a very good question. The brother has asked two very important questions, two great misconceptions.
That's a very good question posed by the sister. The brother asked a very good question. The brother asked a very good question.
The brother asked a very good question, very relevant question.
The sister asked a very good question.
The sister asked a very good question. The brother asked a very good question, very important question.
The brother asked a good question.
The brother asked a very good question. Our Christian Filipino brother has asked a very good question. The brother asked a very good question.
Brother Prasanna has asked a very good question. Very relevant question to the topic.
Brother asked a very good question. Sister asked two questions. Very good questions, but long answers. The brother asked a very good question and a very important question, and a chance to clarify my talk also. Asked a very good question.
The brother asked a very good question.
The brother asked a very good important question.
The brother asked a very critical question.
The sister asked a very good question.
The sister asked a very good question. Sister asked a very good question. The brother asked a very good question.
This is a very important question and a very sensitive question.
Brother asked a very good question. Brother asked a very good question.
Brother asked a very good question. MashaAllah. Brother asked a very good question.
Dr. Pooja has asked a very good question.
The brother asked a very good question.
The brother asked a very good question.
Sisters asked a very good question. A very good question, a very relevant question.
Sisters asked a very important question.
MashaAllah. Sisters asked a very good question. The sisters asked a very good question. The brother asked a very good question.
That's a very good question.
Brother asked a very good question. Sisters asked a very good question, very important question.
The brother asked a very important question, a very sensitive question.
Brother asked a very good question.
Sisters asked a very good question.
Brother asked a very good question.
The brother asked a very good question.
Sisters asked a very good question.
Thank you. Brother asked a very good question.
Brother asked a very good question. The brother asked a very good question, a very relevant question.
The sisters asked a very important question.
Brother, you asked a very good question.
The brother asked a very unique question.
Brother asked a good question.
Brother asked a very good question.
Or justification,
asked a
sir?
very good question. The brother asked a very good question and a very intellectual question. That's a very good question.
Sisters asked a very good question, a very logical question.
Brothers asked a very good question. Sisters asked a very good question and a very important question. The brother asked a very good question. That's a very good question. It's a very important question. Hope that answers the question. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.